Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
For more than 600 years, a strange book has survived without giving up its secrets. Its pages are filled with unfamiliar symbols, mysterious plants, astronomical diagrams, strange figures, and a language that nobody has ever been able to conclusively identify. There are no obvious translations, no known alphabet, no clear explanation of who created it or what they were trying to say. Today, the book is known as the Voynich Manuscript. It takes its name from Wilfred Voynich, the rare book dealer who acquired it in the early 20th century. But the manuscript itself is much older. Scientific dating of its parchment places its creation in the early 15th century, hundreds of years before Voynich ever saw it. And researchers have found evidence suggesting that several different scribes may have worked on the text. News.yale.edu. But what were they writing? The manuscript contains hundreds of pages covered in a mysterious script that has resisted centuries of attempts to decipher it. Professional codebreakers have studied it. Linguists have analyzed its patterns. Historians have searched for connections to forgotten languages. Even modern computers have been used to search for hidden structures. And still, imagine finding a book that is more than 600 years old, opening the first page, and realizing that you can't understand a single word. The alphabet looks familiar enough to seem human. The writing flows naturally across the pages, and the illustrations appear to show plants, stars, animals, and people. But there is one enormous problem. Nobody knows what the symbols actually mean. This is the Voynich manuscript. Today, the manuscript is preserved at Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where researchers can study high-resolution images of every page. The book contains hundreds of pages, although some are missing, and its contents are divided into several strange sections. There are drawings of unidentified plants, astronomical and astrological diagrams, elaborate circular illustrations, scenes showing people immersed in strange networks of tubes, pharmaceutical-looking plants and containers, and pages filled almost entirely with the mysterious script. At first glance, it almost looks like an ordinary medieval scientific or medical book. And that's what makes it so strange. The illustrations seem to give us clues about what the author wanted to discuss. We can recognize stars. We can recognize zodiac symbols. We can see roots and leaves. We can see human figures. But when we look at the writing, everything falls apart. The symbols don't correspond to any known European alphabet. The language has never been conclusively identified. And despite more than a century of serious attempts to decipher it, there is still no generally accepted translation. Even more fascinating is the way the manuscript was written. Researchers studying the handwriting have identified 5 different scribes who appear to have contributed to the book. That means this wasn't necessarily the work of one mysterious person sitting alone in a room, inventing an imaginary alphabet. At least 5 people appear to have been involved. But who were they? Where did they live? And why were they writing in a script that nobody has been able to recognize? Scientific analysis of the parchment places the material firmly in the medieval period, with the manuscript generally associated with the early 15th century. That means the people who created it lived hundreds of years before modern cryptography, computers, or even the printing press had transformed the way information was recorded and shared. And yet, they produced a book that still looks almost impossible to understand. Perhaps the strangest thing is that the manuscript doesn't look like random scribbles. The writing follows patterns. Words appear to repeat. Symbols occur in consistent combinations. The text seems to have structure, which means that somewhere beneath those unfamiliar characters, there may be a real system, a language, a code, or something else entirely. And before we can ask what the book says, we need to understand something even more basic. Who are the people capable of writing it? We don't know what it says. Some believe it is a forgotten language. Others think it could be an elaborate cipher. Some have argued that it is an elaborate hoax designed to look meaningful. And there are even theories that the entire book was created by someone deliberately trying to fool the world. But there is one question behind all of them. Who wrote it? Was a medieval scholar? A physician? An alchemist? A group of scribes? Or someone whose identity disappeared completely from history? For more than 600 years, the author has remained unknown. And perhaps the most frustrating part is that the answer could be sitting in front of us, on every single page. This is the mystery of who wrote the Voynich manuscript. The first thing we have to understand about the Voynich manuscript is that its author may not have been a single person. Modern analysis of the handwriting suggests that 5 different scribes contributed to the manuscript. Their handwriting styles are different enough for researchers to distinguish between them. Yet the pages appear to form one coherent project. News.yale.edu. That discovery changes the mystery. We're no longer simply looking for one unknown author. We may be looking for a small group of people who work together on a book whose purpose has been forgotten. But who were they? The manuscript itself gives us very few direct clues. There is no clear author's name, no date written by the original creators, and no straightforward explanation of where the book was produced. The earliest known history of the manuscript begins centuries after it was created, leaving a huge gap between its medieval origins and the moment it reappeared in the historical record. What we can say with much greater confidence is that the parchment is genuinely old. Radiocarbon dating performed on samples from the manuscript placed the parchment in the early 15th century. That makes the manuscript roughly 600 years old. The dating doesn't tell us exactly when the text was written, but it confirms that the material itself belongs to the period suggested by the manuscript's appearance. Beinecke.library.yale.edu. And the world these scribes lived in was very different from ours. Books were expensive. Paper was still relatively new in Europe. Most information was copied by hand. Knowledge was controlled largely by universities, monasteries, courts, physicians, and wealthy individuals. If someone wanted to create a book containing hundreds of pages, they needed time, materials, and a reason to do it. The illustrations suggest that the people behind the manuscript may have been interested in subjects such as plants, astronomy, medicine, or astrology. But even here, nothing is certain. Some of the plants cannot be confidently identified. Some of the diagrams are unlike anything else known from medieval Europe. And then there is the script. The 5 scribes appear to have written in the same mysterious writing system. They seem to have understood the same conventions, because the symbols and patterns remain remarkably consistent across different sections. That suggests something important. The writing system probably wasn't created spontaneously by each scribe. They may have been copying from an earlier source. They may have been following instructions. Or perhaps they were part of a group that already understood a private writing system. If that's true, then the original author could have lived before the 5 scribes who physically wrote the surviving manuscript. And suddenly, the mystery becomes even deeper. We might not be searching for the person who invented the strange script. We might be searching for the people who inherited it. A forgotten scholar, a secretive intellectual circle, a physician passing down medical knowledge, or perhaps an individual who deliberately created a writing system that only a small number of people could understand. For centuries, people have proposed famous names as possible authors. Some of those theories are fascinating, and some are almost certainly wrong. But one name became particularly famous in the story of the Voynich manuscript: Roger Bacon. If the writing is mysterious, the illustrations inside the Voynich manuscript are almost just as strange. The book is traditionally divided into 6 sections based on what appears in the drawings: plants, astronomical and astrological diagrams, bathing scenes, cosmological illustrations, pharmaceutical-looking pages, and a final section of text that may contain recipes. But these descriptions are modern labels. We don't actually know what the original author believed they were depicting. The first and largest section is filled with plants. Page after page shows roots, stems, leaves, flowers, and what appear to be detailed botanical illustrations. The problem is that many of these plants cannot be confidently identified. Some look like combinations of several real species, while others appear completely unfamiliar. It's almost as if someone took pieces from different plants and assembled them into something new. Then the manuscript suddenly changes. We begin seeing circular diagrams filled with stars, suns, moons, and zodiac symbols. Some pages appear to represent astronomical or astrological concepts, including recognizable symbols for constellations such as Taurus, Pisces, and Sagittarius. But even when we recognize the imagery, we still don't know what the accompanying text means. And then comes perhaps the strangest section of all. Hundreds of small female figures appear inside pools, containers, and elaborate networks of pipes and tubes. Some figures appear to be bathing or immersed in strange liquids. The illustrations are so unusual that researchers have given this part of the manuscript the name balneological, referring to bathing. But again, that's only an interpretation. Maybe these drawings really are about bathing. Maybe they're describing some form of medieval medicine. Maybe they represent the human body in a symbolic way. Or maybe we're completely misunderstanding what we're looking at. The next section contains enormous circular diagrams that spread across multiple pages. Some resemble maps or cosmic structures. Others are almost impossible to interpret. Their scale and complexity suggest that they were important to whoever created the manuscript. But without being able to read the text, we have no way of knowing exactly what they represent. Later pages return to plants, but now they appear alongside containers and what look like pharmaceutical preparations. More than 100 different herbs and roots are depicted, sometimes with jars or vessels beside them. And finally, the pictures almost disappear. The last section consists largely of text, with small star-like symbols marking individual entries. Because of the way these pages are organized, some researchers have suggested that they could be recipes, so the manuscript seems to contain a strange mixture of subjects. Plants, stars, medicine, bodies, cosmology, and mysterious instructions. Taken together, they almost look like the contents of a medieval scientific or medical book. But there's a problem. We don't know what any of it actually says. And that leaves us with an extraordinary possibility. Perhaps the illustrations are clues deliberately placed there to help us understand the writing. Or perhaps they're hiding the truth just as effectively as the text itself. Because if we could finally decode the words, we might discover that the strange images have been telling us what this book is about all along. For centuries, nobody knew who had written this strange manuscript. But when the book finally began attracting serious attention, one name quickly became attached to it: Roger Bacon. Bacon was a 13th century English philosopher, Franciscan friar, scientist, and scholar. He wrote extensively about science, mathematics, optics, and secret forms of writing. To people searching for the author of a mysterious book filled with strange symbols and scientific-looking illustrations, he seemed like a perfect candidate. The theory had a particularly interesting origin. In a letter from 1665, the Prague physician Johannes Marcus Marci told the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher that the manuscript had once been sold to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II for 600 gold ducats. Marci also reported that Rudolph believed the mysterious book had been written by Roger Bacon. Beinecke.library.yale.edu. For a long time, this was one of the strongest clues anyone had. There was only one problem. Roger Bacon died around 1292. The parchment used for the Voynich manuscript dates to the early 15th century, roughly a century after Bacon's death. That makes Bacon's authorship extraordinarily unlikely. The dating doesn't explain who actually wrote the book, but it effectively destroyed one of the most famous early theories. History.com. But the story didn't end there. Another fascinating figure entered the investigation. John Dee. Dee was an English mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He was also deeply interested in occult philosophy and mysterious forms of knowledge. Historical records indicate that Dee possessed manuscripts associated with Roger Bacon and spent time in Central Europe. Wilfrid Voynich later proposed that Dee, or his associate Edward Kelly, might have brought the manuscript to Prague and sold it to Rudolph II. The theory sounds convincing at first. There was a mysterious manuscript. There was a famous scholar interested in secret knowledge. There was a connection to Prague. And there was a historical gap between the manuscript's creation and its appearance in a known ownership record. But there's a major problem. There is no solid evidence proving that Dee ever owned the Voynich manuscript. The idea became popular largely because the known history of the book seemed to fit the theory, not because a document directly connected Dee to it. Modern specialists generally treat the supposed Dee connection as a hypothesis rather than an established fact. Voynich.nu. And then there was Edward Kelly, an alchemist and occultist who worked closely with Dee. Kelly has sometimes been accused of creating the manuscript as a sophisticated hoax. If that were true, the entire mystery would have a very different explanation. Instead of a lost medieval language, the manuscript could simply be an elaborate invention, a book designed to look ancient, mysterious, and meaningful. But again, there is no convincing evidence that Kelly created it. And the more researchers examined the physical manuscript, the harder it became to explain it as a simple Renaissance forgery. The parchment was genuinely medieval. Multiple scribes appear to have worked on the book. The writing followed complex patterns, and the manuscript had apparently existed long before Wilfrid Voynich ever saw it. So the famous suspects began to disappear one by one. Roger Bacon was too early. John Dee was never conclusively connected to the book. Edward Kelly remains only a theory, and the real author was still nowhere to be found. But then the mystery attracted a completely different kind of investigator. Not historians, not alchemists, not scholars searching ancient libraries, codebreakers. And they were about to spend decades trying to do something that nobody had managed before: read the book. Once the Voynich manuscript entered the world of modern scholarship, one obvious idea became impossible to ignore. Perhaps the strange writing wasn't a forgotten language at all. Perhaps it was a code. If that was true, then the manuscript might not be impossible to understand. It might simply require the right person to break it. And over the 20th century, some of the best code breakers in the world tried. One of the most famous groups to become interested in the manuscript was the team of cryptanalysts who had worked on military codes during the Second World War. Among them was William Friedman, one of America's most important cryptographers. Friedman had already helped establish modern methods of code breaking. So when he became fascinated by the Voynich manuscript, expectations were high. Friedman and his colleagues analyzed the strange symbols as if they were dealing with an encrypted message. They searched for repeated patterns, possible substitutions, frequencies of symbols, and structures that might reveal the underlying system. But the manuscript refused to cooperate. The problem was that the writing behaved strangely. Some symbols appeared again and again. Certain groups of symbols seemed to form words. There were patterns that looked too organized to be completely random. Yet the text didn't behave exactly like ordinary languages. And it didn't behave like many familiar forms of encryption either. If it was a simple substitution cipher, where one symbol represented one letter, it should theoretically have been possible to identify patterns and gradually break it. But attempts to do that failed. If it was a more complicated cipher, perhaps the author had created a system specifically designed to hide those patterns. And if it wasn't a cipher at all, then cryptanalysis might never work. That uncertainty has followed the manuscript ever since. Over the decades, people have claimed to decipher sections of the text using everything from medieval languages to mathematical formulas. Some propose that the manuscript was written in Latin, disguised by a cipher. Others argued for Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and completely unknown languages. There have even been claims that individual pages had finally been translated. but none has achieved the one thing required to be accepted as a genuine solution: reproducibility. A real decipherment should explain the manuscript consistently. It should work across different pages. It should produce meaningful text. And ideally, other researchers should be able to follow the same method and arrive at the same result. The Voynich manuscript has never produced that kind of breakthrough. Instead, every proposed solution seems to solve one small piece while creating another problem somewhere else. And that raises a much more disturbing possibility. Maybe the reason nobody has cracked the manuscript isn't because the code is incredibly complicated. Maybe there is no code to crack. Perhaps the strange symbols represent a language that has been completely forgotten. Perhaps they encode information using a system we don't recognize. Or perhaps the entire thing was designed to look meaningful. A 600-year-old book containing hundreds of pages of apparently structured writing, with no confirmed translation. And if it really is a hoax, we have to ask a completely different question. Who would spend years creating something this elaborate, and why? After more than a century of investigation, the Voynich manuscript has reached a strange point. We know the parchment is genuinely medieval. We know multiple scribes worked on it. We know the text follows consistent patterns. We know the illustrations were deliberately created. But we still don't know whether the mysterious writing represents a real language, an encrypted message, or something designed to deceive us. One of the simplest explanations is also one of the most controversial. The manuscript could be a hoax. The idea is that someone deliberately created meaningless symbols and strange illustrations to make the book appear ancient and valuable. If the goal was to convince a wealthy buyer that the manuscript contained secret knowledge, an invented language could have been extremely effective. And there is a historical reason this theory has survived. The manuscript eventually became associated with Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was fascinated by alchemy, astrology, magic, and unusual works of knowledge. According to the 17th century account of Johannes Marcus Marci, Rudolph reportedly paid a huge amount of money for the manuscript. If that story is accurate, someone could have made a fortune by convincing him that the book contained extraordinary secrets. But the hoax theory has a major problem. Creating hundreds of pages of consistent writing would be an enormous amount of work. The manuscript contains thousands of words and repeated structures, and researchers have identified several scribes working within the same writing system. If it was meaningless, someone went to extraordinary lengths to make it look meaningful. Then there is the language theory. Some researchers believe the text may represent a genuine language that has simply disappeared. It could have been written using an unknown script, a constructed writing system, or a language encoded in a way that we no longer understand. The problem is that no known language has been conclusively matched to it. And even after modern statistical analysis, researchers still disagree about what the patterns actually mean. Some studies have found characteristics that resemble natural language. Others argue that those patterns can be produced by carefully constructed nonsense. In other words, the manuscript behaves enough like language to make the mystery fascinating, but not enough like any known language to solve it. In recent years, researchers have also explored another possibility: cryptography. A 2025 study proposed a new type of cipher called the Navy cipher, demonstrating how a cryptographic system could produce text with statistical characteristics similar to the mysterious writing found in the Voynich manuscript. But this was not a decipherment of the manuscript itself. It simply showed that some of the strange statistical properties of the text could potentially be explained by a previously overlooked type of cipher. LiveScience.com. So we are left with several possibilities: a forgotten language, a sophisticated cipher, a constructed language, or an elaborate medieval hoax. And none of them has been proven. Perhaps the strangest possibility is that the manuscript isn't one of these things at all. Maybe we're trying to force a modern idea of language and writing onto something created by people who understood the world very differently. Because until someone can actually read the words, We don't even know what question we're supposed to be asking. And after more than 600 years, the author is still hiding behind the same mysterious symbols. But there is one final question. If we can't read the manuscript, can we at least figure out who wrote it? After more than 600 years, we can describe the Voynich manuscript in extraordinary detail. We know that its parchment dates to the early 15th century. We know that several scribes contributed to the surviving pages. We know the manuscript contains elaborate illustrations of plants, stars, diagrams, and human figures. We know the writing follows consistent patterns. But after all this time, we still don't know who wrote it. There is no confirmed name, no signature, no portrait, no surviving document that tells us who created the manuscript or why. The famous names connected to its history have gradually fallen away. Roger Bacon lived too early to have written the surviving manuscript. John Dee was never proven to have owned it. Edward Kelly remains only a theory. And none of the later attempts to identify the author has produced evidence strong enough to settle the question. Even the 5 scribes who physically wrote the manuscript remain anonymous. We don't know their names. We don't know where they lived. We don't know whether they were scholars, physicians, monks, scribes, or something else entirely. And perhaps most frustratingly, we don't even know whether they understood the text themselves. Maybe they were copying an older work. Maybe they were writing in a language that has since disappeared. Maybe they were following a secret system known only to a small group of people. Or maybe the entire manuscript was created to deceive whoever eventually bought it. Every explanation seems possible. The Voynich manuscript has survived for centuries without giving us the one piece of evidence that would settle the debate. A translation, a name, a clear historical record. Anything that would allow us to finally connect the mysterious writing to a real person. And perhaps that's why the manuscript remains so fascinating. It's not simply an old book written in an unknown script. It's a message from a world that disappeared. Someone spent enormous amounts of time creating these pages. Someone carefully selected the parchment. Someone drew the illustrations. Someone wrote thousands of mysterious words. Someone knew what they meant. And then, that knowledge disappeared. Today, the manuscript sits safely inside Yale's library, where anyone can examine its pages online. The book has survived wars, political changes, centuries of neglect, and countless attempts to decipher it. But the identity of its author remains hidden. Maybe one day, a newly discovered document will reveal the answer. Maybe a forgotten language will finally be recognized. Maybe a future breakthrough in cryptography will unlock the text. Or perhaps, the Voynich manuscript will remain exactly what it has been for more than 600 years. A book written by someone whose name history forgot, in a language nobody can read, telling us something we may never understand.